And welcome back. We just left off with code splitting, which was very, very exciting, but there's actually a cleaner way of doing things. Well, there are several. I'm going to show you one of them. Now, this over here, the this.state.component, that's pretty ugly. And if somebody new to your team comes and they're not familiar with this syntax, they're going to be really confused by your code. Ideally, we can make our code very simple to understand. So let's try and do that. By the way, just to keep things consistent, because components, well, they're technically objects, I'm going to make this null instead of string to keep things consistent. Now, within here, with the cleaner version, wouldn't it be nice if we had some sort of a component, such as an async component that we can wrap around things and just say that this component is going to be async, so just import it. Well, let's do that. I'm going to create an async component, and you'll see why that's helpful at the end of the video. I'm going to go into the components and create a new file, and we'll call it async component.js. Within here, we have the typical import React and also component from our React package. All right, and now we're going to create something called a higher order component. And that's a component that returns another component. It's just like a higher order function. A higher order function, which we've talked about, is a function that returns a function. So again, because components are just functions, that's what it is, a component that returns another component. Just like we had connect in Redux. So the way we create this, and by the way, as I'm writing this, if this goes over your head, don't worry, async component is pretty standard. You can go online and search for it, and all the code for this async component pretty much looks the same. So you just have to get used to it. If you want to learn more about higher order components, the React docs has a higher order component section, and it's going to really help you out. But for now, stick with me. It's all going to make sense. We're going to first start off with export default. We'll call this async component with lowercase a, which is a function. So we'll just say export default function async component. And this async component, remember, because it's a higher order function, it's going to need a component as a parameter. So I'm going to say import component. So that's going to be page 2 and page 3 for us. And now finally, within here, we get back to our syntax that we're familiar with. That is class async component, but this time with capital because it's a class, it's a component we're creating that extends component from React. And within here, we have the constructor that is going to also receive props. And again, we have to call super with props in order to have access to them. And we'll just say this.state equals component equals to null. So just like we had in app.js, we're going to have component null here. Now, within this next part, we're going to do component did mount. Now, if you remember, we need to load these page 2 and page 3 components, and they were promises because we used .then, and then we had to set state to whatever component we received. Just for fun, I'm going to show you how to do it with async await, just so that you get a little bit more extra info. So again, with any asynchronous function, we can just say async. And within here, we can now use the await keyword. So we can say const default, and this is a bit of destructuring. If you remember the default over here. We're just destructuring to just make sure we're getting the default component. And that's going to equal component. And how do we get these? Well, we do the await and do our asynchronous code, which is going to be import component. Because with this, we're going to be able to import our page 2 and page 3 component. So all we're doing here is what we had over here with component equals page.default. We're now going to have access to the component. Now within here, we can finally do this dot set state component equals component. Again, the very same thing we're doing over here with component equals to page2.default. It's just a shorthand, cleaner way of doing it. Finally, we want to render the component. So I'm going to say const component, because we don't know if it's going to be page 2 or page 3. We just want a generic component name. And this is going to equal this.state.component. And finally, in here, we can just return. If we have a component, we'll say pass down the component and any props that it may have. Using a bit of destructuring, we could just say if this component has any props, also include them. And we have to make sure we wrap that like this. So remember, because we've passed down props to async component, if somehow anything trickles in, pass them down to component. Otherwise, just render null. Don't render anything. Finally, because we're wrapping this in a function, we have to return something, and we want to return the async component. So we can just say at the bottom, return async component. Let's save. Now I'm going to run npm start here, just so it checks for errors. We still have to import it. Async component now we can use, but this might still look a little bit confusing. So let's see how we can use this component now, this higher order component. I go back to app.js, and I'm going to import async component from our components folder. Now we can use this async component to clean this up a bit. We can, well, let's comment this out and go back to the way we had it at the beginning when we didn't have any code splitting. But this time around, for this return statement, we're going to say that we want to have a async page 2 that equals the async component. And remember, it's a function, so we're going to call within this function with the first parameter being that, remember, it's import component. So to import the component, we just do import components dot slash page 2. Let me make that a little bit smaller. There you go. All we did here was say async component, which is a function we created, is going to take a parameter that imports the component. And from that imported component, we're going to grab the default, the component.default, and add it to the state. And then we're going to return and render the component. So going back here, I can now say async page 2. This will return async page 2. And we can do the same for page 3. I can say that in here, we have async page 3. So now our component is async page 3. Let's save. All right, I'm not getting any errors. Let's see if it actually works in the browser. Let's go back and refresh. we have our bundle. If I clear this, click on the second page. All right, I get another file and another file. Perfect. Now, did you notice how we had 3 and 4 here? That's because up here, we still had the imports. So now we're creating 4 chunks, which we don't really want. We can now remove all of this. So now we can just go back to the way we had things with this dot set state. I'll save, go back. Let's refresh here. We have the bundle.js. If I clear and go to page 2, there you go. Page 2, page 3. Very, very cool. And you saw that flash. We don't see that flash anymore, but initially, when they're loading, there's a bit of a flash. And that is a trade-off that you need to decide on. Do I want this quick flash where the user has to wait to import the JavaScript files so that our load time, initial load time for the first bundle is faster? And that's something that you just have to decide as a senior developer. But now you have the tools to decide what you want to do. And you might be looking at this and saying, is this actually cleaner than what we did before? I think it is. I think the async component is definitely a little bit tougher to grasp. By the way, just in case you're confused about this, again, if I just leave it the way it was to have component like we've done before, well, in that case, again, it's still going to work. So that was just a shorthand way of doing it. But anyway, getting back to the point, now we're able to use async component anywhere we want in our code. And anytime we need to load something, we can just wrap it in async component, import the component, name it whatever we want, and render it. One last thing. If I go back to my npm run build, we open this up and we see that compared to last time, we actually have a bigger bundle size for the main. We have 1 byte here, but we don't have to worry about that. Our bundle size just increased. Now, why is that? Because in our main bundle now, we've included the async component. Because remember, in app.js, we import async component. Again, always think of trade-offs. Is this the best thing to deliver to the user at the beginning? And do we want to asynchronously load these chunks? But I hope you had fun and you see some of the power of asynchronous loading and code splitting. It's a pretty new topic, but I think something that every company should consider when delivering JavaScript to the user. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.